Hello everyone, welcome back. We're going to talk about what goes into obtaining the highest quality image, an image with the most details in it. There's quite a lot that goes into it, so we're going to look at what affects the detail in your image and why you might not get the detail that you wanted. This is obtaining the highest quality image. Enjoy. The sharpness of an image or the detail inside an image can be the result of pretty much only two things. One of them is the resolution of your camera, how much detail it can actually absorb. And it's quite a finite limit, and it's limited to how many megapixels are in your sensor, and that is referred to as your resolution. And the second thing is the micro contrast, or the contrast between pixels. We've spoken about detail before. That contrast from a micro level to a global level exhibits the detail within that image. There could be loads of detail in front of your camera, but if that micro contrast doesn't exist within the image, the details will not be evident. And there's a few things that will affect that micro contrast and all those details. We must look outside of human error for this one. There's many things you can do wrong personally to affect the amount of detail that is shown in the end result of your image. Firstly, you could be the best photographer in the world and take the image perfectly. But if you take it on a camera that has a small resolution, in other words, let's call it a 12 megapixel sensor, it is going to capture much less detail than a 45 megapixel camera. That's just the way the sensor works. There's nothing you can do about that. So there is an advantage of having a camera with a big sensor that has a lot of megapixels in it. What is a common mistake though, and I remember many years back being caught out by this very mistake, is believing that with a large resolution sensor, you are always going to capture a lot of detail. But that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot that needs to happen for that sensor to capture those details that you want, and we're going to go into them now. The first and the most common problem is the lens itself. Remember, those details need to reach your sensor in order for it to render those details into an image. I remember having a setup once where I had a large resolution, very nice camera that had a big sensor for capturing details, but I had a very cheap lens on the end of it, and I never got the details I wanted. Because it does matter, the quality of glass inside a lens will help the sensor read better details, more details. Unfortunately, the better quality of the glass, the higher the price of the lens, but it certainly does help. You can take a picture of the same animal with the same camera body, which has a large sensor, one with a cheap lens and one with an expensive fixed focal length lens which has high quality glass, and you can get two very different results because one lens is helping bring more details to your sensor. And then there's a handful of aberrations that might occur according to our lens, sometimes regardless of its price. It might be due to its focal length, it might be due to the light, but we must understand them so that we're not confused when it happens to our image, and realize that we actually can fix it in various methods these days, especially in post-processing. The first we're going to talk about is vignetting and why vignetting happens. This usually happens with large focal length lenses, and you can imagine with the light coming into that lens from different angles, sometimes the light starts to bounce down the lens and deflect off edges. And what that can cause is a vignette. The corners of your image start to darken. Sometimes it actually looks quite nice, sometimes it really doesn't, and often you can fix it quite easily in post-processing. Similar to this is called light fall-off. Now this process is slightly different, but the end result is the same. The edges of the frame start to darken, and again, sometimes it's quite minor, but sometimes it can be quite detrimental. Another problem we might face that might diminish the quality of our image is something called chromatic aberration. And we must remember that our camera sensor has a filter in front of it called a Bayer filter that has red, green and blue filters, and it's absorbing rays of light according to red, green and blue. And especially in scenes of a high dynamic range, when you've got a very bright background and a very dark subject and you're shooting quite close to it, those beams of red, green and blue can sometimes align differently. This is the most common scene where chromatic aberration might occur, is along your dark subject. You'll notice lines of color along the edge of your subject. They could be red, green, blue or purple, but sometimes they can be quite significant and can completely destroy a subject. What's really nice is that in post-processing these days, it's the click of a button and it can 99% of the time remove any chromatic aberration. Another thing that you must be aware of is something called diffraction. Now diffraction happens when we use very high apertures. A lot of the time, cameras these days can come with aperture values ranging from f2.8 all the way to f32 in some zoom lenses or large focal length lenses. Now personally, I don't see the point in f32 and I've never ever used it. If If I'm capturing a wide scene with a wide angle, f16, f18 will usually capture details from the foreground to the background. With a zoom lens, even if you shot at f32 and your subject was close to you and your background was far from you, your background's still going to be blurry. It just can't manage that depth of field correctly. And what happens when you go usually about f18, f20 upwards, diffraction happens. Now the process is quite complicated, but what you need to know is that you start to lose detail. It is minor, but if you're a perfectionist, those details will be evident when you zoom in, especially in post-processing or if you print the image big. So try to avoid diffraction. I know that apertures from f18 or f20 upwards are very rarely used, almost never used. And in fact, in a scene where you might think that you need it, there's probably a better way of doing it, such as focus shift shooting, where you can take a number of images, focusing on different elements of the scene and merging them together. Rather stay away from such high apertures. Another problem you might come across, especially when using very wide angle lenses, things like fisheye lenses or even 16mm lenses and so on, is something called lens distortion. Now, a fisheye lens is usually used underwater for underwater photography where there's no straight lines. So it works very well. The problem is when you come into a scene where there are straight lines, these very wide angle lenses start to distort the frame, which means elements more central in your frame will look normal or close to normal. But as you go towards the edges of the frame, those straight lines start to bend. And this can be highly destructive to images that need those straight lines to be straight, such as landscape images, or when you're shooting in a street where buildings have very straight lines. Lens distortion can really mess up the image. Again, with a bit of effort in post-processing, you can fix those distortions almost to the point where you don't notice them or very close to it. The last thing we're going to talk about in capturing detail, capturing the highest quality image, are certain elements that we can't avoid. And that's what happens between the lens and our subject. Often when there's a lot of distance, things like dust can be in the way, and that'll diminish the detail that your sensor is able to capture. Humidity is another one. If there's a lot of humidity in the air, again, your sensor's not going to see that detail, so it can't capture it. And especially in Africa or hot places, and there's a lot of distance again, heat waves. Heat coming off the ground creates heat waves, and when you look at a heat wave with the naked eye, you can see that your subject, even if it was still, is actually moving. Your sensor can't see through heat waves, so that can affect the amount of detail your sensor can absorb and essentially the quality of the image. So that's obtaining the highest quality image. You've got to understand these things because it will help you when you look at your end result. And if there's not enough detail in your image, if the quality's been diminished, consider the things that we've just chatted about, because if you're certain all your settings in your camera are right, it might be one of these aspects that are diminishing the detail and the quality of your image. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that makes sense. See you next time.